Hello and welcome to Jurist Books. Jurist Books is a forum that bridges the gaps between ideas, libraries, and the authors. In this series of Jurist, we shall be talking with authors of new emerging scholarships. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this interview. Good day, I am Vishwajeet Deshmukh, the Multimedia Co-Director at Jurist Legal News and Commentary based out of Mumbai, India. And today I will be discussing the book Freedom and Unruly History, written by Dr. Annelien De Dijn of University of Utrecht. Hello and welcome to Jurist Book Series. Today in our series we have Dr. Annelien De Dijn from University of Utrecht. She is a professor of modern political history and has written the book Freedom and Unruly History, which has won the 2021 PROSE Award from the Association of American Publishers. She has been a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University, UC Berkeley, and Notre Dame Institute of Advanced Study. We are honored to have you, ma'am. How are you doing today morning?
Good, thank you. It's great to be here.
So getting to your book at the very first instinct, it is certainly a new exploration of how we conceive freedom and how we understand freedom in the modern sense. Could you enlighten us? How did you get with this concept? Because in the acknowledgement you mentioned that you were at a rally while at UC Berkeley, which was protesting President Barack Obama's Affordable Health Care Act. Could you take us through your thought process? How did you transpire through this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I first started thinking about this book about a decade ago. And at the time, I was a postdoc. I was living in the Bay Area, and I was a visiting scholar connected to UC Berkeley. So I was walking around on campus, and this was during a very fraught time in US political history. I mean, not that there are any times in US political history that are not fraught, but at the time, Obama had just been elected. And one of the things that he and the Democrats were trying to do, they were trying to reform the healthcare system by introducing something called the individual mandate, which would make it obligatory for people to buy healthcare. And the idea behind that reform was that by spreading the costs of healthcare over more people, the costs would go down and healthcare would become more affordable for many more Americans than were eligible at the time. And what struck me while I was sort of watching TV and following these debates was that this reform, which to me as a European seemed a fairly common sense idea, and largely something you should really want to do, right? Make sure that everybody has access to healthcare. That this created a surge of protest in the United States, and that those protests were, to a large extent, articulated by an invocation of the concept of freedom. So the arguments of the opponents of what later came to be known as Obamacare argued that Obamacare was, this terrible thing because it was harming their freedom. It was, the first step on a slippery slope to, the end of American freedom, the beginning of, this totalitarian regime. And what I will always remember is walking around on the Berkeley campus and seeing these. I don't think they were students, I'm not sure, but they were young people holding a placard of Obama with a Hitler mustache. And so, signaling that this was sort of, the beginning of a dictatorship just as bad as that of the Nazis. And I was so surprised by that. I was, I couldn't understand why people would equate the first black president of the US with Hitler. So that sort of sparked my interest. So, general questions, what do they mean by freedom? And how do they come to have that? Why do people have that conception of freedom? And that sort of, sparked the whole, that sort of set me on route to write a long history of freedom. And the central question of the book that I eventually came to write was, how did freedom come to be equated with the absence of state intervention. Why do people like those protesters against Obamacare? Why do they believe that any sort of thing that the state asks us to do that is harming their freedom? Right? Because the reforms introduced by Obama were fairly broadly supported. They had Democratic support. In my view, at least, it was fairly obvious that they served a beneficial goal, and yet they were sort of seen as this grievous threat to freedom. So that sort of got me thinking: how did that idea come about? That we think that having rules and regulations, any kind of rules and regulations, that is something that harms our freedom. What I discover in the book is that idea of freedom, that people in what we now think of as the West have been talking about freedom for a very long time, but that originally they meant something very different by it, and that this identification of freedom with an absence of state intervention, that is something actually fairly new. So that is the idea I ended up developing in the book.
You received your PhD at KU Leuven in 2005 and you went to the United States. So, would you say that the concept of identity, you being a European woman, changed your understanding of this concept as well, and it influenced you to look at it from a different perspective, country as well as gender?
Well, definitely coming from Europe did sort of that played a role in sparking my interest in this debate, because at the time, at least, in Europe, political debates, I mean, what I just was really struck by the fact that freedom played such an important role in American political debates, because at the time, it didn't play that role in European political debates. So when I started writing this book, I thought that my sort of fellow Europeans, that I live in the Netherlands, that there would be not that much interest in my book in my own country, because in my imagination, at least, freedom was a concept that played less of a role in Europe, in contemporary European politics than it did in U.S. politics. And but what I realized during the whole coronavirus crisis is that I was actually wrong about that, because what I found really striking, if you look at today's debates about coronavirus policies, you see the exact same sort of mobilization of the concept of freedom as had happened back in the day during the Obamacare debates. And you see those debates happening all over the developed world, so not just in the US, but also in Europe. I was really struck by the fact that so many people in the Netherlands and in neighboring countries, just like they did in the US at the time of the Obamacare reforms, they took to the streets to protest the imposition of new rules and regulations designed to protect, collective health, designed to protect us against the coronavirus, and they were claiming those rules and those new laws and those regulations are bad because they're harming our freedom. We're in danger of becoming the victims of a totalitarian state. So what I ended up realizing is that even though I saw this as very much an American thing, it is actually very much a transatlantic conception of freedom.
So it's certainly a 2,000-year-old history that you have dissected throughout this book. And you focus on the concept of having critiques and dissenters, and they being the builders of the modern democracy, with the understanding of liberty and freedom. So how do you distinguish these two when it comes to critiques and dissenters with the liberty lovers of Age of Revolution? What's the distinction between these two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the sort of the question that I started from was, where does this idea that freedom means not having the state interfere with you, and that in order to have freedom, you need a government that is as small as possible, that interferes as the least possible amount with our lives. So where did that idea of that particular conception of freedom, where did that conception of freedom come from? And in order to answer that question, I ended up doing something producing a book that focuses on what I call the long history of freedom. So the book starts in ancient Greece, where and that's a context in which for the where we have lots of that's a context where you find some of the oldest sources talking about being free and what it means to be free. And I bring that story all the way up to the present. And if you look at freedom from that long-term perspective, so from sort of antiquity to the present, what is really striking is that for a long time, people in what we now again think of as the West, when they talk about freedom, they did not mean small government, and absence of state intervention. They meant something very different. When they talked about freedom, they meant having collective control over the way you're governed. So not being governed the least amount possible, but getting to co-decide over the laws that you have to live under. And that is what I call the democratic conception of freedom. So in a way, that was sort of the original conception of freedom. That's when people, let's say in the 16th and 17th centuries, when they thought about being free in the political sense, that's what they thought about first and foremost. Being able to co-govern, to collaborate, to contribute to making the laws under which you are living. So, and that means that if you want to be free, you need a particular set of political institutions. You need institutions that give all of us, the people, control over the way in which we're governed. In other words, you need a democracy. My argument is that our current way of thinking about freedom, so the way of thinking that equates freedom not with collective self-government, but with the absence of government, with small government, that way of thinking emerged much later. It emerged only in the early 19th century. And the reason why it emerged, or the group of thinkers responsible for inventing this new way of thinking about freedom, I argue, are the counter-revolutionaries. So they're the opponents of democracy. So by the late 18th century is a really key period in European and indeed Atlantic political history, because that's when, for the first time on a fairly on a broader scale, attempts are made to introduce governments that are perhaps not fully democratic in our sense of the word, but that are more bottom up than the old regime governments of the 17th and 18th centuries, than the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries. And those attempts are sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful, as in the case of the French Revolution. But they do something really important. They spark a huge backlash against democracy. And that backlash is articulated to a certain extent in terms of freedom. So opponents of these democratic revolutions of the late 18th century invoke the concept of freedom, and they start arguing, look, these Democrats, they claim they want to set you free, but they're going around the wrong way to do that, because being free, democracy doesn't help you to be free. Democracy means one thing. It means, rule of the unwashed, the wicked, the masses, and they'll use that freedom either in a really bad way, because they're unfit to govern, or they'll use it to redistribute property and destroy all, civilization. So that is one set of arguments they make. And they then continue to argue, if you do want to be free, you need to do something very different. You don't need to democratize your regime. You need to make sure that your government remains within certain boundaries, within certain limits. So that is how we. So that is the first time that argument is articulated in European political thought, that what you need in order to be free is small government and not collective democratic self-government.
So to broadly understand this as well, what I understand is not all institutions get to present dissent always in a democratic setting. It's also a factor of who gets to be a dissenter. And how do you tackle this aspect of whose dissent is to be taken into consideration, and sometimes dissent isn't even recorded? So, as a historian, how do you delve into those aspects of dissent which perhaps were not acknowledged in broader senses throughout the history?
Yeah, that's another really great question, and I have struggled with this because so I'm an intellectual historian, which means that my sources are they're written sources, and they're actually fairly highbrow written sources. So the sources that I look at, they include, for instance, the writings of Plato, and of many lesser known thinkers. And I also examine I try to sort of examine as broad an array of sources in my book as possible. So I don't limit myself to political treatises. I also look at paintings, coins, for instance, novels, poems. But in the end of the day, my main sources are sort of written political treatises. And that, of course, skews your view in a certain way, because throughout history, only a very limited subset of humanity was able to leave a written record of their thoughts. That is, of course, a major limitation of the kind of research that I do. And I try to be aware of that, I try to sort of include to as much as possible the voices of those of excluded groups in the population. And when that's impossible because those sources are simply not available, I try to sort of alert the reader to this. For instance, if you look at Greek sources, ancient Greek sources, so the ancient Greeks, in particular the Athenians, were incredibly proud of the fact that they were that they had a democratic government, and they put a lot of stock on this. But if you look at the way in which their government was actually structured, we would have a really hard time agreeing that it was democratic, because it excluded so many, such a huge proportion of the population. Athenian government excluded, all women, so women were not able to actively participate in Athenian politics. It excluded slaves, and it excluded foreigners who were not born from it. So the Athenians, even though they constantly invoke this concept of democracy, when you look at their when you look at that issue of who was allowed to govern, we would have a really hard time agreeing that their government was indeed democratic. So what I try to do in the book is not take these claims at face value, but to point out repeatedly who was excluded. Then when you get to the later 18th century, the situation changes, because thanks to increasing literacy, that's a period in time when you see that groups that were previously completely marginalized and excluded from public debate are increasingly able to leave written sources and to leave traces of their thinking. That is when it becomes possible to sort of include those marginalized voices as well. But that, in my story, in my long-term story, that happens fairly late in the day. That only starts happening in the late 18th century. That's when you see that larger numbers of women start leaving, start writing political treatises, but also people of color, for instance, people like people that were formerly enslaved start leaving, start writing about politics and about their ideas, and start contesting the claims of these of more hegemonic groups.
So one thing which I found very fascinating, because as lawyers also we tend to be dependent on more written sources, but you mentioned that you have also explored art and coins. Could you just give example of how dissent can be viewed through that as well, through paintings and coins?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. So there's a very rich iconography of freedom, which also has a very long history. So originally, when people talked about freedom, originally what they meant was something that I call a juridical category. So originally the word freedom was used as a contrast for enslaved persons. So you were either in the law of persons, Roman law of persons, you were, and that also was true in the Greek era, or in most Near Eastern civilizations, you were either a free person or you were an enslaved person. In the Roman era, a sort of an iconography develops to indicate that difference, because Roman slaves, when they were emancipated, they were given a hat, and that hat sort of a floppy hat, and that hat comes to be known as the cap of liberty. And what you quickly see is that this symbol starts being used to symbolize freedom, not just in the sense of not being an enslaved person, but also in the sense of political freedom. So, for instance, the people who ended up murdering Julius Caesar, after butchering Caesar, they took to the streets. Our sources tell us, and they carried this hat, the cap of freedom. They carried that with them, and they were claiming, sort of visually claiming, look, we liberated you, the Roman people, from this would-be king, from this would-be tyrant, and we've set people free. And what you see is that later on, in later centuries, that symbol of freedom starts, popping up in various contexts, but that it also starts to be claimed by groups that were previously excluded. It becomes, for instance, a symbol that plays a very prominent role in the context of the French Revolution, where it becomes associated with the most radical democratic elements among the French Revolutionaries, the Jacobins. And then in the American context, this symbol also plays a really interesting and big role. And what you see there is that this symbol becomes very, it becomes very controversial, because people know that its original sort of that it originated in a context of freedom from slavery, and hence you see that in the South, for instance, the Southern planters, that they start making deliberate efforts to invent new symbols of freedom that do not refer to slavery, because they don't want to bring enslaved people on the idea that there might be something wrong with slavery. And interestingly enough, that is actually that is one of the reasons why the Statue of Liberty, the Statue of Liberty has a very distinct iconography, which deliberately does not refer to this, this cap of liberty. And the reason for that is because, even though the people behind the Statue of Liberty were, prominent and they were very anti-slavery, but they wanted to avoid that whole controversy, and hence they came up with this more neutral iconography.
It's very fascinating to just see that there's so much. We think of freedom in a very philosophical sense, that there's so much material history attached to it, and this gets me to this very recent film which won the Academy, Get Out, which is directed by Jordan Peele, which dealt with how race in America has played a role. And in that one particular scene, I remember cotton being referred to as one of the modes for freedom for the slaves, how they were into cotton plantation, how they went back. So The material history of it is certainly very fascinating. But coming more to the digital era and contemporary America and the globe itself, uh, I would like to understand your scholarship in context of the events of January 6th when rioters had stormed the US Capitol, and uh, there was one very distinct tweet by Samuel Fisher, one of the rioters, where he says that can't wait to bring a liberal back to this Freedom Palace. So, how do you view such people and their understanding of freedom? Because in many ways they try and call themselves as dissenters, as rioters, as liberty lovers. But how does your scholarship view these people, and how does freedom relate to them?
Well, another great question. I would say that my book can help us understand how freedom became, in essence, today a concept that is most frequently invoked by right-wing and conservative politicians. Because if you look at this from a historical perspective, that's actually that's actually strange. If you look at freedom, historically speaking, the word was, for a long time played a huge role in emancipatory movements, such as, for instance, movements for more democracy. But also later on, freedom becomes a key concept for the socialist movement. So the socialist movement viewed itself as an attempt to bring greater, not just political but also economic freedom to everyone. But if you look at the way in which the concept of freedom is used today, I sometimes one gets the impression that it's a concept that is that has become almost wholly or most fervently embraced by the right. By people on the right wing of the political spectrum, by conservatives, and I think that it is true both in the US and in Europe. And I think my book can help us explain how that happens, because what I try to show in the book is that even though freedom was for centuries used as a sort of a concept to argue for democracy, so the claim was, if you want more freedom, you need more democracy. In the course of the 19th century, in the wake of that counter-revolutionary reaction, freedom becomes an anti-democratic concept. It comes to be mobilized by anti-democratic forces, political forces. And I think that is also what happened during those most recent controversies in the US about the storming of the Capitol. Because what you see there is that there's an unwillingness or an inability to accept that democratic majorities, that their will is binding, and that you should accept your political loss. And an argument that if the Democrats, if they gain political control, then this is something that you need to resist, because it threatens, it will potentially harm your freedom, and it will put the US, it will turn the US eventually into a totalitarian state. And I think that fits really nicely, or that becomes much more understandable if you understand that today, people who talk about freedom, so the most ardent freedom fighters, they're actually the heirs of those counter-revolutionaries of the early 19th century.
So most of them even posted pictures, with rifles and shotguns, and they try to just the documentation of it, which is covered by several news agencies as well. Does that also form a part of the iconography, which perhaps will be noted in the history but not acknowledged? What is your opinion on that? Just the iconography of the entire situation, where how they stormed it, how they entered it, and I'm more interested in understanding that aspect of it. How freedom.
So what exactly are you thinking of? So what part of the iconography?
people with different kind of flags with different affiliations, and this could range from any kind of caps which are being worn of any particular political leader, rifles, shotguns. For example, some of the writers, they entered Nancy Pelosi's office. They tried to destroy it. They vandalized it. So this vandalization, in terms of an icon, I mean, who couldn't call it iconography in many ways, but it's a more visual form of challenging the government and how they are functioning. So uh, how would this be written down in the history later on when supposedly a right wing government forms a part of it? Do you think it would be looked upon as a act which is very daring, that people were a part of it?
I don't know. I find it hard to say because I mean the iconography was more bizarre, so I didn't really recognize a lot. I mean, if you look at the slogans, they're very recognizable, but the iconography, at least the iconography that we were fed in Europe, so the guy with the with the horns, etc. I mean, that was mainly that was fairly bizarre. So I think that that is such a particular subset of these right wing groups that I don't really see any sort of connections with the longer term history of freedom there.
The reason why I ask this is because there is a trend of global rise of right wing across various states, and this is not only limited to Europe or America, but even many Asian states, even including India, where I am currently. Uh, so hence, I sometimes view how history would be looked upon when it is put in the hands of people who are governing it, and they're trying to demean the others who try to uphold those principles. And perhaps these writers would later on, I hope not, but sort of are given a very different kind of a proud status that, oh, these are the people who were trying to defend the faith.
Okay, now I get what you're getting at. So you're saying, well, to you maybe these people look like they're bizarre and weird, but if Trump gets to power, he'll be celebrated. They'll be celebrated as sort of proud precursors, and I mean that is very possible. And indeed, history, unfortunately, is usually written by the winners. So that is and I'm sure if Trump were to come to power, I mean, you already see attempts by the Republicans. I mean, it's very obvious to sort of claim that this was a legitimate expression of popular discontent and not a bizarre attempted coup. So there are already attempts being made to rewrite history in that sense.
So I would like to deviate a bit here, and I have a question which relates more with the aspect of identity and freedom. And to this, I will put you the concept of racial passing. How in America, many African Americans tried to pass as white on account of their lighter skin tones, and later on attained freedom because they were given better opportunities, but in turn lost their identity or their status. So, what is your view on the loss of identity at the behest of freedom? Is that really true freedom in many sense?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very personal question. And I've obviously never been in a comparable situation. Well, I mean, I can imagine. Yeah, perhaps it's not entirely true, but I mean, I would. It would seem to me that this would be a huge price to pay for. Well, if you want to call that freedom, then why not? But you might also call it having different opportunities for advancement. But I mean, I can only imagine that must be a huge and very painful price to pay. But if you look at so of this, at this again from a more historical perspective, then I would argue that sort of the in the longer term, the safer or the less costly course to take is to as a group who is marginalized to when this is possible, at least to use any opportunity to have to reclaim your space as a group in the public domain. As for instance happened with the gay and lesbian movement. Gays and lesbians were also marginalized throughout history, but what you you can, as a gay person or a lesbian person, you can respond to that by pretending that you're not gay, for instance, by marrying and having children, which is something that many gay people historically did. But I think, speaking here as a gay person myself, that it's less costly. I mean, for yourself to not give up your identity, but to use the opportunities that you have, at least if you live in a democratic state, to reclaim your space as a group in the public domain, as it has happened for gays and lesbians with the struggle for gay marriage.
That brings me to a very interesting point, because I at times call it the price of closet. Uh, just one instance that really struck me was there are quite a few hospitals in Mumbai which don't allow MSM or people who identify with the LGBTQ community to donate blood at all. So at just one of these rallies, people were singled out because the social workers knew that they are a part of this community. So had they not known about their identity, they wouldn't be discriminated at all. So it's also, I think, a price one pays to be free from their own prejudices. So that's how I look at it. But coming more to your scholarship, which deals with the authoritative government aspects of it, and what we do at JURIST is currently we are reporting from the ground with most of our editors and writers from Myanmar. We have even one of our own, several of our jurist journalists being there are warrants against them because they are reporting these incidences. So, as the term coup d'état, which is a French term, how does this French statocracy of military power transpire through a transcontinental perspective? Looking at Myanmar as an example at this moment, how the National League for the NLD was taken over by the military junta. How does your scholarship view such kind of freedom and liberty concepts when it comes to a military power which takes over? And the same is also applicable to Afghanistan in many senses now with the takeover by Taliban. So, how does your scholarship deal with this transcontinental perspective?
So my scholarship, in my book at least, and also in my scholarship more broadly speaking, I focus on the history of political thought, mainly within Europe, and the main reason for that is that that is sort of my specialty. So I'm not sure whether I would have anything particularly interesting to say about what's happening in Myanmar, but obviously it is true that military style coups are they also happen very frequently in throughout European history. So yeah. Yeah, I mean,
how I view it currently, being with those editors and having words with them, even interviewing them on quite a weekly basis. Uh, the military's view of freedom, or how they view liberty and how it has to be preserved, is inherently very different from the government which was at power. So it's just a very subjective interpretation that I wish to understand as to how militaries, when these coup d'etat, because as you mentioned that you're an expert of the European concept of liberty, how does this military understanding of freedom from a more statocracy point of view emerge? How militaries view freedom and liberty?
Well, I mean, that is intriguing. Do the military in Myanmar, for instance, do they invoke the concept of freedom? Do they claim they're making their people that they're setting their people free?
Just for example, they have stated that students can go back to universities and schools and everything, but then many of the protesters who are against their movement have boycotted the same. So their view of freedom, for example, even in an Afghanistan Taliban kind of situation, where they have mentioned that okay, girls can go back to school, but uh, you might as well sit differently with a curtain between boys and girls, which wasn't the case before Taliban took over. So in their view, they want them to go ahead, okay, you do what you want, but I will take a hold of it. So in many ways, they think that they are giving freedom and liberty, but their understanding is very different from what was happening before, what the Western notions have been raised up to. So that is what I wanted to understand. Is it the same which happens in a more European perspective as well, as to how militaries view them, or do they look at the restrictive aspect more coherently?
Well, so there is a famous British philosopher. I'm sure you know who I mean, Isaiah Berlin, who famously distinguished between negative and positive liberty. And negative liberty, when he talks about negative liberty, he says, well, that is the liberty to do what you want, and not being interfered with by somebody else. And Berlin then also goes on to claim that you can have that liberty even if you live, under a dictatorship, as long as that dictatorship is, sufficiently enlightened to, give people, things like religious freedom, etc. And it sounds like the military rulers of Myanmar might be making similar claims, right? We are allowing you to do what you want, hence you're free. But that sort of way of thinking about freedom, I think, so that sort of thinking, the way of thinking about freedom, is very different from that way of thinking that I've described in the earlier parts of my book, that democratic way of thinking. Because according to the democratic way of thinking about freedom, you cannot be free in a dictatorship, even if you have, quote unquote, liberal dictators, right? There's an argument made by Fareed Zakaria that what we really need globally is not a promotion of democracy, but the promotion of liberalism. And it doesn't really matter who's doing the ruling in a particular country, as long as you have lots of individual rights. But I would argue, and the many of the political thinkers that I'm interested in would argue that position is is not sustainable, because if, as a population, you give control over the way in which you're governed to sort of an outside force, like an unaccountable dictatorship, you actually do lose your freedom, no matter how many rights they claim to uphold. Because in the end of the day, if you're not sort of ready to if you don't have mechanisms for exercising control over the way in which you're governed, you're going to be forced to do things that you in your view are not in your own interest, and that hence harm your freedom.
Oh, that actually makes perfectly more sense in terms of just being under someone's regime and then how them dictating you to what you want to do. I think that distinction is very, very relevant in this aspect. Uh, so Jurist itself was an organization that was formed with a more digital motive in 1996 when it's almost 25 years since we have been reporting these kind of incidences. And this is right from the Kosovo War in 1999 to the most recent Afghanistan takeover by Taliban and Myanmar. Uh, in a more globalized world where there is communication which is so freely established, do you think that it is our responsibility as a global community to, undertake this concept of freedom and profuse it throughout the world, considering that we have channels now? And you, as a historian, know that throughout the 2000 years that you have studied, communication itself is not very well possible between states. So, do you see the concept of freedom going from a more state-related entity to a more global entity, which perhaps agency like United Nations has to uphold in a much stronger way?
That's another really great question. So, what I would respond to that is, so if you again look at that long history of freedom, you see that you see two different things. First, what you see is that, and that is a history that I don't really focus on in my book, but it's also a really important part of the history of freedom. You see that the concept of freedom was used from the beginning of the colonial era by European colonizers to legitimate all sorts of colonial projects. So that is part of what you might call the dark history of freedom. So in the 18th century, for instance, European political thinkers developed this concept of Oriental despotism. So the idea is that only Europeans can be truly free, and that Asian countries are, by definition, ruled in a despotic manner. And that ideology is then used by colonizing powers, for instance, by Great Britain, to take over power in various regions, under the argument that either they're going to liberate the people living in those regions, or it doesn't really matter that they're taking over power because they weren't free to begin with, so they're not doing anything harmful. So, and that is something that continues happening throughout the 18th and 19th century, all the way up to the end of the colonial era in the 1950s and 1960s. And that is something that and you might argue that it's fairly recently happened also in the run-up to the war in Iraq, where one of the major sort of claims made by the Bush government was that we are going to war in Iraq, not just to sort of for as a counterstrike, for supposed counterstrike for Al Qaeda, but also because we're going to liberate the Iraqi people from this horrible dictatorship. So so in international relations, you see that the concept of freedom was very frequently invoked by European powers to legitimate all sorts of military expeditions and colonial enterprises abroad. And that is one aspect of the history of freedom, a very important aspect of the history of freedom. But what I think you also see is that there's another aspect of the history of freedom, and that is that that concept can be used by peoples, both European peoples, but also, so not states, but peoples themselves, both in Europe, but also outside of Europe. It has been used to fight against and to protest against those attempts. For instance, the Indian movement for independence, freedom, played a huge role in that movement as well. So in more direct response to your question, I think we need to be very wary and careful to argue that as a global community, we have sort of a duty to export freedom or to promote freedom. And we need to be wary of that because what is the global community? If it means an assembly of states led by the U.S. Government, I would argue let's not do that because in recent history we've not had good experiences with that. But I do think, on the other hand, I do think that if you mean sort of civil society activists or I mean, yeah. So I do think that the concept of freedom, could and it has in the past played a role in a more emancipatory manner in a global context as well.
That's yeah. I think now I understand why your book sort of ends towards the end of Second World War and doesn't go beyond it, because then the entire aspect of post-colonial understanding gets ahead with it. But it's I agree with your understanding of a colorable motive of freedom and liberty and how that can be exploitative in many sense. But if I were to just question that, what was the world doing when Hitler was, running the concentration camps? It's sort of that sort of a question. Was it not the obligation of that time it was League of Nations, of course, but was it not the duty of the global community to look after them? That is something which I am more interested in knowing. It feels very difficult just looking at my peers from Myanmar who work along with me, have arrest warrants come out against them for the same things that I am doing. So, in a more subjective manner, yes, perhaps it does. You do appeal to me in a more what could be the consequences of it in a more larger sense, especially with the Oriental argument that you provided. But my final question or final thought from your side would be: how do you see freedom evolving in a more digital or technological atmosphere with new technologies and AI making more decisions, where at times people can't even confront the people who are making the decisions, and we're driven by large data. How do you see freedom evolving in this environment, which is of course technologically motivated in many sense now?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I mean, the way in which most people think about freedom today, well, where there is this a claim that if you want to be free, you need to be able to do what you want as much as possible and not be interfered with. Yeah, so in that context, I would argue there are reasons why people would think of their freedom as being. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about privacy and how our privacy is, under threat of being harmed by these large companies. And I think that this is indeed a real concern, and not just by companies, but also by governments that have sort of, they're spying massive, have these massive spying operations on their own citizens that are completely unaccountable. So I would argue that is something that we definitely need to worry about this new capability of governments to control us through new developments like AI or facial recognition. But I think what I would argue is something that we really need to keep in mind is that the solution, at least in my view, is not to say, okay, we need to make sure. Well, I think the solution would be to argue that we need more democratic oversight over such operations and over such attempts to, because this is going to happen anyways, right? I guess I'm not really, I'm not really sure whether, I guess I'm just thinking out loud here, but I do wonder whether just trying to, like the EU has a much more stringent privacy law, for instance, than the US. And there are historical reasons why that is the case. But I wonder whether you can stop these developments from happening at all. So I think the key here is to make sure that you have more democratic accountability, and not just over governments, but also over enterprises that have a lot of power over our interactions with one another.
I think it's a beautiful way to summarize it, is just being conscious and mindful about our democratic liberties while going ahead with these technologies. And I really like the last point you pointed out, with the private corporations having much more power on us. Just for example, Facebook and Google, what they could do with the amount of data they have with us. It's amazing. And thank you so much, Dr. De Dijn. It has been a wonderful experience, and thank you so much. We will be attaching the link of your book in the description of this video. And of course, it would be amazing to have a wonderful discussion with you once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vishwajeet. It was a pleasure talking to you.